Anne Michaels' poetry was shortlisted for the Trillium Book Award, and then she was the recipient of the Trillium Book Award for her novel Fugitive Pieces. Tonight she will share with us a section from The Winter Vault. Please welcome Anne Michaels.
It's a real pleasure to be here and to be celebrating the Trillium Award. Awards always bring readers to books, books to readers, and that's always a fantastic thing. But the special thing about the Trillium, of course, is that it celebrates literature from here, from this place where we live. And the thing that's so extraordinary is the variety, the depth, the breadth of variety, even in the 7 readers who you're hearing tonight, such variousness. And every shortlist is like that for the Trillium, and I think that's a very, very healthy sign. So, yes, I'm going to read just a few pages from The Winter Vault. This book deals with 3 historic events. The first is the building of the Aswan Dam in Egypt in the 1960s and the relocation of the entire nation of Nubia because of the flooding of the dam. This entire country is submerged, and that sense of place, sense of home, what happens when you can not only are you in exile, but the place where for thousands of years your people have lived, that place no longer exists on the face of the earth. When the dam was built, they knew that thousands upon thousands of archaeological sites would also be drowned by the dam. And so most of these sites, of course, almost all of them were lost, but there's an effort to save some of the more significant sites. And there's a huge international campaign put into place to save the Abu Simbel temples. And many ideas were put forward about how they should be saved, what should happen. Do we leave them where they are, enclose them in glass, and have an elevator go down into the bottom of Lake Nasser, the new lake? How do we save it? And in the end, they decided a very simple solution, but an absolutely staggering feat of engineering, which was to dismantle the temple block by block, piece by piece, and simply move it higher up. And what was created was an exact replica. And this first section that I'm going to read has to do with the moving of the temple. The second event in the book, the historical event in the book, is the building of the St. Lawrence Seaway, which also dislocated thousands of people, flooded villages and towns, and new cities were built. Not only were towns lost in the building of the seaway, but of course, as in Nubia, graves were flooded. And Ontario Hydro offered to move the bodies, to move the graves. Some people took them up on this offer, but most left their dead where they were. And for decades afterwards, people were literally afraid to swim in the river for fear that the dead would rise up in the water. And Hydro, of course, put forward the solution of moving graves as if it were a simple thing. The third historic event in the book is the rebuilding of the city of Warsaw after the Second World War. And this, too, involved a very interesting problem. The city was entirely demolished and not destroyed by, in the course of battle or through aerial bombing, but through an actual dismantling of the city. Numbers were painted on buildings to show the order in which the building should be raised. And so the city was sort of taken apart with a kind of macabre reverse town planning. And so after the war, the Poles had a very, very disturbing decision to make. How were they going to rebuild? What would that rebuilding be? Of course, many places were facing the same question, and sometimes the decision was to leave the ruins where they were and build right next to them. Sometimes the old city was completely bulldozed and a brand new city put in its place. And in Warsaw, they decided to, in fact, make an exact replica, again, a replica of the old city. So every door frame, every paving stone, every street lamp, every cornice was exactly identical to what had stood before. And this, of course, was extremely understandable response to that kind of mass destruction that had happened, but also incredibly disturbing. And people wandered into this replicated place with a kind of madness that they were standing in a place that they remembered and yet, by all rights, should no longer be there. And one can understand this impulse, too, so well because, you know, the desire is to bring back the past and bring back the dead. And, of course, we can never bring back the dead. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the very beginning of the book. And this section is the section that takes place in Egypt, on the banks of the Nile, where the Abu Simbel temples are being taken apart and put together. And there's just a paragraph of an epigraph at the beginning, or sorry, a foreword. Perhaps we painted on our own skin with ochre and charcoal long before we painted on stone. In any case, 40,000 years ago, we left painted handprints on the cave walls of Lascaux, Ardennes, Chauvet. The black pigment used to paint the animals at Lascaux was made of manganese dioxide and ground quartz, and almost half the mixture was calcium phosphate. Calcium phosphate is produced by heating bone 400 degrees, then grinding it. We made our paint from the bones of the animals we painted. No image forgets this origin. Generators floodlit the temple, a scene of ghastly devastation. Bodies lay exposed, limbs strewn at hideous angles. Each king was decapitated, each privileged neck sliced by diamond-edged handsaws, their proud torsos dismembered by chainsaws, line drilling, and wire cutting. The wide stone foreheads were reinforced by steel bars and a mortar of epoxy resin. Avery watched men vanish in the fold of a regal ear, lose a shoe and a royal nostril, fall asleep in the shade of an imperial pout. The laborers worked for 8 hours, dividing the day into 3 shifts. At night, Avery sat on the deck of the houseboat and recalculated the increasing tension in the remaining rock, reevaluated the wisdom of each cut, the zones of weakness and new stress forces as, ton by ton, the temple disappeared. Even in his bed on the river, he saw the severed heads, the limbless minions, stacked and neatly numbered in the floodlights, awaiting transport. 1,042 sandstone blocks, the smallest weighing 20 tons. The miraculous stone ceiling, where birds flew among the stars, lay dismantled out in the open, below real stars. The real blackness beyond the floodlights, so intense, it seemed to be coming apart like wet paper. The workers had first attacked the surrounding rock, 100,000 cubic meters carefully plotted, labeled, and removed by pneumatics. And soon, the building of artificial hills. To free himself from the noise of the machinery, Avery listened for the river flowing past their bed, his head against the hull. He imagined clinging to the dark wind, the steady breath of glass blowers in the city 500 kilometers north, the calls of water sellers and soft drink vendors, the shrieking of kingfishers through the surf of ancient palms, each sound evaporating into the desert air where it was never quite erased. The Nile had already been strangled at Saad el-Ali, and its magnificent flow had been rerouted before that to increase the output of Delta cotton, to boost the productivity of the unimaginably distant Lancashire mills. Avery knew that a river that has been barraged is not the same river, not the same shore, nor even the same water. And although the angle of sunrise into the great temple would be the same, and the same sun would enter the sanctuary at dawn, Avery knew that once the last temple stone had been cut and hoisted 60 meters higher, each block replaced, each seam filled with sand so there was not a grain of space between the blocks to reveal where they'd been sliced, each kingly visage slotted into place, that the perfection of the illusion, the perfection itself, would be the betrayal. If one could be fooled into believing he stood in the original site, by then subsumed by the waters of the dam, then everything about the temple would have become a deceit. And when at last, after 4.5 years of overwork, of illness caused by extremities of heat and cold, or by the constant dread of miscalculation, when he stood at last with the ministers of culture, the 50 ambassadors, his fellow engineers, and 1,700 laborers to gape at their achievement, he feared he might break down, not with triumph or exhaustion, but with shame. Only his wife understood that somehow holiness was escaping under their drills, was being pumped away in the continuous draining of groundwater, would soon be crushed under the huge cement domes, that by the time Abu Simbel was finally re-erected, it would no longer be a temple. The river moved, slow and alive through the sand, a blue vein along a pallid forearm flowing from wrist to elbow. Avery's desk was on deck. When he worked late, Jean woke and came to him. He stood up, and she didn't let go, hanging from her own embrace. "Calculate me," she said. I've run out of time here, so I'm just going to read one last paragraph from near the very end of the book. "At the cemetery," said Jean, "nearby to Elizabeth's grave, was the grave of another child. There, someone had left a magnificent garden of plastic flowers. Ferns grew lush out of a thick square of florist foam, and in the foliage stood 2 painted china dogs. Each plastic flower had been carefully chosen: roses, hyacinths, tulips, lily of the valley. There was love in each molded crevice of leaves and petals. I remember when I was young, looking at plastic flowers in a shop. I heard someone say, 'They're not real,' and I couldn't understand what they meant. I was holding one in my hand. Of course they were real." The child's garden rested on its thick green foam, above the cold spring ground. It was as real as anything. A child would have thought that garden beautiful. Everything that has been made from love is alive.